Thanks everybody for joining us today. What we're going to do is I get to talk about the raised beds. And this is one that I'm excited to talk about because I am at a location where I'm potentially going to have to install some raised beds this year. So this is something that I was doing a little bit more research on and looking into. So to start off, when we talk about raised bed gardening, let's talk about the advantages and the disadvantages. We'll talk about the different types of raised beds and the location of raised beds, and then we'll touch on the management. So one of the things you will not see on here is going to be a plant list. And the reason for that is because a lot of the traditional vegetables that we would put in an in-ground bed would also work in a raised bed. And John gave us that awesome list of ones that will work in a container, which will also work in a raised bed. So there's lots of options. We're not as limited in the raised bed when it comes to those different vegetable cultivars or varieties that are out there. So some of the advantages to raised bed gardening is going to be higher yields. The reason for that is because we get to pick what soil or potting media is in that raised bed. We're not limited like with a traditional in-ground garden. The soil we have is the soil we have to work with. With a raised bed, we can amend it, we can make changes to it, we can improve that soil structure so that way we have better root growth, better drainage, better water holding capacity, you name it, we can have better in that raised bed. We can also plant more intensive. So we can put more plants in a smaller space, kind of do a block style garden, put more plants in there because we are not going to walk through there. We don't have that garden path like we would normally have with a traditional in-ground garden. So we don't have to save spaces for us to get in between plants. We can plant them closer together. Just keep in mind, some of our different cultivars of plants are more prone to certain diseases if we don't allow enough air movement through there. So just because we're planting more intensively doesn't mean that we still don't need that current airflow through there. And like I talked about, we're not having that room for those paths on there. So we get to pick that soil. Like when John was talking earlier about the potting mix that goes into your containers, we can amend the soil that goes into our raised beds. We can add amendments like compost and fertilizers. And the good part about a raised bed is we are amending only that area where the vegetables are growing. In their traditional garden, we till under or we work in compost or organic matter throughout the entire garden. But with a raised bed, we're going to add it only to those areas where the raised beds, where the plants are going to be. We're not adding it to the garden path, which means that we're not having to add something that's not going to do a whole lot of good. And because we don't have that traditional garden path in a raised bed situation, we don't have that soil compaction in the bed area, which means that our beds are going to be fluffier. It's going to be easier for some of our root crops to root down a little bit, and we're going to have that reduced traffic in that area. So, it's really a lot of advantages to that. Some other advantages is that ease of maintenance. And this is something that I'm really looking forward to because if we make that raised bed high enough, we're not having to stoop over to weed or water or do other chores in the garden. We're able to bring that raised bed up. We're not having that potential fall hazard or trip hazard or things along those lines. We're going to have reduced weed growth. If we intensively plant those raised beds and we have that dense leaf cover, we're not going to have that possibility for weeds. And it's easier for us to weed because we have a small spot that we're able to focus on. Now, when we talk about some other advantages, but we can put the floating row cover over the top of our raised bed to help with those insects. And I know Jody's on, so if you want to know what questions about insects, she'd be happy to help you out there. But with some of our raised beds, we can put a pipe, PVC pipe, bend it over, make like a tunnel, And we can actually put that over the top. So if we've got those early season cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, things like that, that get that cabbage worm, we can cover them up with a floating row cover, and we don't have to worry about all of our broccoli being having a whole lot of worms inside or anything like that. So if they don't require a pollinator, we can go ahead and put that floating row cover right over the top. I've seen people actually turn it into like a cold frame where they put plastic over the top so that way it warms up quicker and then they can still harvest for it. So it's kind of like a mini greenhouse too. So there's lots of advantages with that ease of maintenance. And because we get to take a look at that soil quality, we're able to provide for better drainage in that area. So if you live in a part of a state that has a heavy clay content, you know, if we're trying to amend that soil to the point where we can have improved drainage, it's going to take a long time to get that soil to a point where we're going to have good success with our vegetables. So we do have that improved drainage, and those plant roots are growing in that mix above a waterlogged soil or in an area of compaction. I actually had a client that was trying to grow a garden in a specific location for several years, and he struggled. And of course, if we're struggling, we recommend that you get a soil test and you take a look to see if there's anything going on with your soil structure. Come to find out, it was off the charts on so many different areas, to the points where it was being toxic to a lot of his vegetable crop. And so in that location, we recommended that he put in a raised bed because the soil that he has there is not a good soil to be growing vegetables with. And so you can kind of pick and choose with a raised bed what your soil is going to be like within that raised bed. Maybe it's going to be a problem area for you. And so by putting in a raised bed, you are still able to grow those vegetables that you like. And of course, everyone would like to plant earlier. We can have that extended growing season because those soils are going to warm up earlier in the spring because they're raised up. They're also going to dry out quicker, which is a blessing and a curse, but it does allow for that better drainage. So by using a raised bed, getting it up off the ground, we're able to plant just a little bit earlier than we would in, let's say, a traditional garden. And one of the advantages to having a raised bed is we make it work. We can put raised beds in areas where gardens aren't normally grown, whether that's on rooftops or other locations that, you know, might be a little iffy. So for me, my backyard, I have a big dog and 2 kids. And so I am trying to think of a way that I can keep everyone out of the vegetable garden. And I know that's not going to be possible. So by putting in a raised bed, now we have that barrier where it's more difficult to run through a particular area. So it's raised up off the ground, but we can make that location work. It also is adapting the garden to work with the gardener, whether you have a differing ability or a disability. This is one way that if you love your garden, but you can't get down on your knees, or you just aren't really steady on your feet and you need to sit down, or you're just not able to stand for a long period of time, what this does is if you raise that bed up high enough, you're able to work with the gardener. The gardener doesn't have to reach as far. We don't have to bend over. We don't have to get on our knees to pull weeds anymore. We can sit on that cheek wall that's seating height, and we can pull weeds. We can do our maintenance of our vegetable garden from that location and not have to have a safety hazard or worry about falling or getting hurt. Now, there are some disadvantages to raised beds. I'm sorry, but it's not all sunshine. But what we can see with raised beds is because they're elevated up off the ground, they may dry out quicker in the summer months, which means that we possibly may need more water, or we need to watch it just a little bit closer to make sure that we have enough moisture in there. If you have a heavier soil in a traditional garden setting, it's going to hold moisture very well. Well, when we take a look at that raised bed, because we are able to amend the soils that go in there, it's got really good drainage. Really good drainage means that it's not going to hold on to that moisture quite as long. Now, there is some space required for a raised bed. We've just like with a traditional garden, you're going to need to devote space to those raised beds. And so sometimes that can take room out of the landscape or out of the turf area. So you do need to have that location where you can place a raised bed. And then there's always the cost of installation and materials. There is a raised bed type that doesn't require a lot of additional installation. But if we go with a traditional elevated raised bed, then we're going to have that additional cost of that installation and those materials. And that cost can vary greatly depending on what kind of raised bed you install. Whether you make it yourself, whether you get a ready-made kit, whether you pay someone to come and install that raised bed, there's going to be some costs involved. So when you're planning out where your raised beds are going to go, figure out the size that they're going to be, and then also help to plan out and get a budget. How much is it going to cost? It's going to cost more up front, but for a while, you're not going to have to worry about replacing or things like that. And I know there's a question in the chat, how often do the boards in the raised bed need to be replaced? Well, that really depends on your situation. It depends on the material that you use, and it also depends on where you live at. So I don't have a good answer. It's going to last for 5, 10, 15 years because everybody's growing environment and everybody's location is just going to be a little bit different. But with that, we want to make sure that the boards are going to be in that location for a few years. We want to be on the lookout. We want to check them on a regular basis, whether that's yearly, every other year, to make sure that they're still in good repair so we don't have to replace them that year. So there are different types of raised beds. We usually just think of a raised bed as one that's up off the ground, but there are several different types of raised beds. So the raised ground bed is the simplest form. What that is it is a mound of dirt. It can be anywhere from 6 to 8 inches high, and all it requires is additional soil and additional compost and things along those lines. The thing to keep in mind with any raised bed is because we're not walking through the bed, we're walking around the bed, we need to make sure that we're able to reach from one side to the middle and from the other side to the middle. So oftentimes raised beds are usually going to be 3, 4, maybe 5 foot wide at the most, because most people's reach from center is going to be at least 3 feet. So you could go up to 6 feet with that. But we need to make sure that whatever raised bed we choose, that we're able to reach to the center from one side and the center from the other. So we can make it as long as we want, but it's that width that we need to be concerned about. And so on the one side, they've got a path that is at least 2 feet wide. And we need to be careful with that raised ground bed because we need to make sure that our soil is not sloughing off and falling into the path where we have to take it back up. You can put different mulches on top to help hold that and make sure that it stays in that location. But like I said, this is the simplest form. It allows you to do some different things. So, you're not having to put as many inputs into it in terms of installation. So with our raised ground bed maintenance, we need to avoid stepping on the bed more than what is needed. And ideally, we'd like to not walk through the bed because we would like that to stay as light and fluffy and aerated as possible. Keep that bed from slumping into the paths, and you might need to reshape on a regular basis just to make sure that we're not losing that 6 to 8 inch height on there. You can add organic matter to that on a regular basis. Ideally, for our gardens, we'd like to have at least 5% organic matter content in our soils. So that's going to be one where on a regular basis, we're adding just a little bit of organic matter every year. We don't want to add a whole lot at once because then we have a lot of nutrients available at one time, but a little bit goes a long way every time. So this is the example of that in-ground raised bed. It's raised up 6 to 8 inches. They have their walking path. They also put mulch down in this location. And what that helps to do is it helps keeps those darn weeds from coming up in that path. So the mulch that we can put down helps us out when we are having to weed. Like we said, we really don't want to have to stoop over or do anything about that. But when it comes to the maintenance, I know there's a question in the chat. We don't need to hand till just a slight raking. So it depends on what kind of organic matter you're putting into that in-ground raised bed. You know, if you're putting in compost that's already broke down, you don't really need to work it in too terribly deep, just rake it in. There are some people that you know, tilling can add additional compaction, especially if it's done too wet, or maybe it'll only go to a certain depth. So as long as you're continually working that soil and you're just adding a little bit of compost at a time, raking that in, putting that back in, that soil is going to stay fluffy and it's going to stay light in that location. We don't need to do deep tillage in those areas in order to maintain it. But that mulch in the path, it's going to help to keep the weeds down. There's lots of different options for mulch. You can use dried grass clippings. You can use straw. There's a entity in Nebraska that uses soybean mulch. And that one's kind of fun because you don't get the little volunteer wheat everywhere. You don't really get many volunteer soybeans. And it's also helping to add nitrogen back into the soil. You know, those are going to work really well in that kind of a location. So this is the raised bed type that most people are familiar with. This is a supported raised bed. What it does is it has edging on the raised bed, and it places a barrier between the garden and the lawn. And let's just be honest, Kentucky bluegrass is one of the more aggressive perennial weeds that we have out there. So if you're trying to put a garden next to a lawn, we need to make sure that that Kentucky bluegrass is kept out of that garden area. And this is one way that you can do that. Now, when we talk about installing this, there's a lot of questions that I get about, do I put plastic down first? And the answer is no, we don't put plastic down first. We don't put rock down first. We want that plant root to be able, and we want that water to be able to drain out. So by putting it in an area that is on top of soil, we can do that. Now, I have seen some people try to put containerized raised beds on parking lots and things like that. Those are that fine line between, is it a container, is it a raised bed, kind of a thing. But with these, we want to put them directly onto the soil surface so that way that water can drain away. The frame adds a neat finished look, and it helps to keep that potting mix contained, or that media contained within that frame. It helps out quite a bit. And there's lots of different ways to make raised beds. You can go online and find all sorts of plans out there and all sorts of different methods that people use in order to make raised beds. So I didn't provide one because we all have a different location. We all have a different site. And let's be honest, we all have a different budget when it comes to installing a raised bed. So your best bet when you're looking for an above ground raised bed is you are looking for one that fits your budget. So do your homework, see what's out there, find what works best for you, and then do the installation of that raised bed. Now, next is going to be the containerized raised bed. This is a raised bed on steroids. This is going to be a raised bed that's at least 27 inches tall. What this does is this is a comfortable working height, whether you have a differing ability or maybe we're looking at safety as being one of the things that we want to use with this one. So that's going to be a 27 inches is a good seating height. It's also a good height for those working in a wheelchair. But what containerized raised beds do is you can put them in areas that have high traffic, and it helps to protect those plants from those high traffic areas. Raising a bed up high enough can help to reduce the reflected heat on paved surfaces. So, you know, if we have somebody in a wheelchair, there's going to be those paved surfaces or those ADA compliant surfaces. And so by raising that up, we can help to reduce that reflected heat. So by raising that bed up higher than 10 to 12 inch walls, we maximize that physical accessibility. So most wheelchair users, 27 inches is comfortable working height, and the width should match the gardener's arm reach. So if you are not able to comfortably sit on the edge and reach in to reach the middle, then that raised bed is too big, and it's going to be very difficult for you to do the management that you need in the center of that raised bed. Whether it's weeding, watering, picking, those are all things that need to be done. And so you need to make sure that you're able to reach the center of that raised bed. Now, I threw a bunch of other ones into a category called other raised beds. The reason for that is there's many different options out there. And so you can pick what works best for you and for your price range. And it can be made from a wide range of materials. So don't think that when we talk about raised bed that we have to have that above ground raised bed structure in our mind where we have to have lumber and we have to use the 1x2s or the 2x6s or whatever, not 1x2s, if we have to use that lumber in that area. So don't stop with just we have to use lumber for this. So like John talked about earlier, we can purchase pre-made raised bed kits. These kits are available from a wide range of retailers. The one is a snap together plastic one that you can put in a particular location. So the thing to keep in mind is with these, sometimes depending on what plastic material we use, we need to know whether or not it's going to be safe to use for vegetables. And sometimes what happens with plastic is if it sits out in the sun for a while, it gets a little brittle. And in Nebraska, we have hail. So sometimes those plastic raised beds can succumb to hail damage as well. So those are some things to keep in mind when we're talking those plastic raised bed kits. Other ones, like the wooden one on the other side, on the right-hand side, this is one that is stackable. So you can make it as tall as you want. You can make it 1 level high, 2 level high, 3 level high. You get to pick and choose how tall that garden is going to be. Put the things together, peg them in, and it's going to be one that's done fairly quickly with minimal amount of effort, minimal amount of required materials for that one. There's also other types of raised beds. You know, like I said, don't stop with just the traditional wooden raised beds. You can use bathtubs. Technically, I think it could be a container, but we're just going to throw it in the raised bed presentation for today. What this gardener down on the bottom part has done is they have made a retaining wall. And within that retaining wall, they have put in that vegetable garden. So this is one where you could do a raised bed in an area. Now that retaining wall block is going to be a little bit longer term than, let's say, like the lumber. It's going to be more cost up front. but it's going to be one of those that if you are avid gardener, you know you want to keep it in that spot for a long time. Go ahead and explore that retaining wall block to see if that's something that's of interest to you. And John discussed this in our container workshop, but I had this one in here. So, you know, John's warning with this is to be careful with the metal containers because some of the metals can leach. We just need to make sure that we use old metal containers that aren't going to leach those materials into our vegetable gardens. What these are the raised beds of one of my master gardeners. She had knee surgery, and so it was very difficult for her to not only get up and down, but can't put pressure on her knees. And so being the good Nebraska person she is, she found a bunch of old stock tanks that were rusted out or bent up or just not really usable by stock tank standards. And so she backfilled them with some good potting media, and then put her vegetables in it. Now, keep in mind, when we're planting raised beds, we need to make sure that the gardener can reach from the edge to the center and have to pick and do things like that. Now, if you know how big a stock tank is, especially these big cattle tanks, that's not feasible. No matter how tall you are, how long your arms are, there is no way that you're going to be able to reach the very center of this stock tank. And so one thing to keep in mind in this kind of a situation is when we're talking about watering, this master gardener used above ground overhead irrigation. And so she learned with time that she had to put the sprinkler in the middle of the stock tank on a pole. So that way, when she wanted to water later in the season, she wasn't having to go in and disrupt the plants that she's already planted. She also learned the hard way not to plant toward the center of the stock tank, which means that you're going to have a dead spot in the center where there's not going to be any plant material in there. But it is a way that if you already have these at your disposal, to recycle what you have and to use what you have. But like I said, we just need to keep in mind that with any raised bed, we need to be able to reach the center. The one down in the bottom is an example of her ground raised beds. So her ground raised beds are raised up again, that's 6 to 8 inches tall. She's able to walk around the edges and reach toward the middle. So that is an option too, like we said, with that ground raised beds, to raise that up just a little bit so you're able to amend the soils in that location. This location was kind of a little iffy. It had a little bit of sandier soils to it. And so by using those stock tanks and the ground raised beds, this allowed to increase and improve that soil water holding capacity in those locations, especially where she planted those raised beds. Now we talk about locations. So ideally, if we're looking at those that produce a fruit, we want to have at least 8 to 10 hours of full sun. So that way we get the best production. If we're looking at those that are leafy greens, or maybe that they produce a stem, we're looking at 4 to 5 hours of sunlight for those. Regardless, we need to have good air circulation because we can see when we plant plants too closely or we don't have good air circulation, that's where we have issues with like powdery mildew fungus in those locations where we are decreasing the photosynthesis of that plant by allowing that fungus to take hold. So we need to make sure that we have good air circulation in those areas. Now, where we're planning on putting that raised bed is just as important as the raised bed itself, because we need to consider the proximity to a water source. And it really depends on how you're going to water. If you're going to drag a hose over to it, if you're looking at putting some kind of sprinkler system in there, if you're looking at putting some type of drip system irrigation, you need to know where those are located at in your yard, in your landscape, to know whether or not it's feasible for you to hook up to your irrigation system or whether you're going to have to use a hose. Now, the thing to keep in mind is we need to make sure that we're not using our irrigation system sprinklers to water the garden, because oftentimes those that are set for turf are going to water more at the wrong time than what the vegetables need. So if you're going to install your raised bed in a particular location that was once turf, you need to take a look at your sprinkler heads to try to deter them from watering that garden spot every time you water the lawn. We need to stay away from marshy areas or areas that don't drain. So those areas that produce cattails, or maybe when you walk across and it's really squishy. We want to stay away from those areas, because what's going to happen is we're going to have that moisture, we're going to put that soil on top of it, and then it's going to wick up into that raised bed. And that's not something that we're looking at doing. The good news is we can place this in areas where there's poor soil quality. And this is one of those locations where we can put the raised beds in close proximity to black walnuts. Black walnuts produce a product called juglone that inhibits growth of certain plants. And our beloved tomatoes is one of those plants that it inhibits their growth. So we need to make sure that we're not getting any leaves or anything from the husks of the black walnuts or anything along those lines in there. But we can put it in a location, let's say, where we're on top of the black walnut roots or things like that, because the tree's roots go out 2 to 3 times the height of the tree. Your paths can be as narrow as 1 foot in between. 2 foot or 3 foot is usually going to give you more room to work with and to walk on, but they can be as narrow as 1 foot. So with a landscape design background, my first suggestion is, when in doubt, sketch it out, lay out those bed lines, lay out that location where you're thinking you're going to put that raised bed before you install it, because once it's installed, you want it to stay in that location for a while, because it was a lot of time, effort, and energy into that raised bed. So if you orient your raised bed east and west, you have a slight advantage, and I say slight, of collecting heat for frost protection. So if you're looking at going a little bit later in the season, we can go that east-west direction. So north to south has a slight advantage, because the sun's going to come up in the east, it's going to go and set in the west, which means that bed running north and south will get sunlight throughout the entire day on both sides of that raised bed. When we talk about location and layout, it really depends on the produce. How many raised beds are you going to need? That question can be answered on how are you going to use that produce. Are you going to only eat it fresh? Are you going to freeze it? Are you going to process it? The more you're going to do with that produce, the more people that are going to consume that produce, the more area you're going to need to devote to vegetables and to the raised beds. When we talk about media in a raised bed, we can go across the board. We can do a mix of soil and organic matter, whether that's compost, aged manure, peat moss, coconut coir, any of those we can do. We can do a mixture of topsoil and compost. So I mean, the main thing is we don't want to just put topsoil into that, because over time what's going to happen is it's going to get kind of compacted. Some of those topsoils make a big ball. It doesn't allow for drainage. So we need to amend what's in our raised bed a little bit, whether that's adding compost or coconut coir, perlite, things like that. I will say that there are commercially available potting mixes that you can use in this situation. The thing to keep in mind is, if you're talking a fairly good sized raised bed, it can get very expensive. And so by incorporating the topsoil you have with some compost, with some other amendments, you can really make a good quality mix for that location on a fairly low budget. Now, keep in mind that over time, those containerized raised beds, those above ground raised beds, they're going to settle. So as they begin to settle, as they begin to age, that's where we're adding more each year of amendments, whether it's adding a little bit more compost or organic matter in there to make sure. And planting. So when we talk about planting our raised beds, those compact forms, those smaller ones, the ones that John talked about for the container, will leave some more room for other plants. Make sure to keep those very aggressive plants from taking over the entire garden. And the one that comes to mind is going to be mint. Mint is great, mint is aggressive. Know that when you put it into a raised bed that it's going to try to take over. So keep those very aggressive plants in mind so you don't have to devote the whole raised bed to mint if you don't want to. If we're doing those vining crops, make sure that they have plenty of space. Whether you're allowing to vine out on the ground or you go up a trellis, you need to make sure that they have room to do what they want to do. If we're able to put those tall plants along the north end of the garden, what this allows it to do is the north end will allow the shade to be cast on the north side. So you're not shading out those other plants. If, however, you're practicing your good crop rotation and not putting that plant family in that location for 3 years, sometimes that can get a little tricky. And so this is one of those instances where we can grow up with those tall plants and we can utilize that shade with those shade loving plants, whether it be some leafy greens, some lettuces, some spinach, something along those lines. Use that shade to your advantage and rotate those plant families. Keep that plant family out of a particular location for at least 3 years. Now, when it comes to irrigation, we've all heard that overhead irrigation should try to be avoided if at all possible. And the reason for that is it can spread some diseases. We can get some splashback, things like that. Sometimes it's just unavoidable. That's the easiest way to water the garden, and we just need to keep that in mind. So if we're going to be using that overhead irrigation, make sure we do it early in the day. So that way that plant material has an opportunity to dry out. And also consider mulching around the base of those plants that are prone to diseases like tomatoes where they get blight and things like that. If we're able to hand water, sometimes that's really time consuming. So we need to make sure that if we're going to only hand water in that location, that we have the time and energy in order to do that. And we can always install drip irrigation. That's one of the easiest ones. You can get some systems that turn on and shut off at a particular time. So we're not having to mess with them. But like we talked about, one of the disadvantages of raised beds is the warmer soil temperatures early in the season, increase plant density. They're going to dry out quicker. So you're going to have to possibly irrigate more. And with that, we are done with that portion of the presentation. And so we will answer questions. So Lori, for the orientation north, south, east, west, I am talking about the widest side, correct? Not the ends facing those directions, the sides running in those directions.